Welcome to the value of wisdom as a category for ancient texts and discourses. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. To do this, you'll grab your smartphone and follow the instructions here. Either scan the QR code with your camera app or go to the slido.com website and enter the number you see on your screen. Enter your location and it will be shown here. We'll wait for you to do this. We'll wait a few moments. When using your phone, after scanning the code, tap the pop-up on your screen to open Slido. Again, use your phone to scan the QR code or open a browser on your phone or your computer and enter slido.com and then the number on your screen. I see we have representation from across the planet. We have Hamilton, Ontario. Hey there, Richmond, Virginia. Birmingham, UK. Anderson, Indiana. Cleveland, Ohio. Lexington, Kentucky. Yonkers, New York. Zurich, Switzerland. Welcome. Rivervale, New Jersey. Scotland. Macon, Georgia. I hope I'm going to pronounce this correctly. Saskatoon, SK. I'm not familiar with that place. I haven't been there yet. I have a feeling somebody's going to let me know. Calgary. Edinburgh. Cape Town, South Africa. Wow, we have a lot of people here. That's great. Fredericksburg, Virginia. Vancouver, British Columbia. Cincinnati. Eton, UK. Winchester, UK. Oxford, UK. Durham, UK. Philadelphia, PA. Wilmington, North Carolina. Italy. Scotland. Los Angeles. Mapleton, Utah. Well, we have a good representation here. We welcome you all here, and we hope you enjoy today's broadcast. This webinar is hosted by Union Presbyterian Seminary, now offering the new Master of Arts in Public Theology degree program. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists include Dr. John J. Collins, Holmes Professor of Old Testament Criticism and Interpretation at Yale Divinity School. Dr. Catherine Dell, Reader in Old Testament Literature and Theology at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Will Kynes, Associate Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Samford University. Dr. Jacqueline Weintraub, Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Yale Divinity School. And Dr. Stuart Weeks, Professor of Old Testament and Hebrew at Durham University. Our host and moderator is Dr. Samuel Adams, Chair of Biblical Studies and Professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Dr. Adams, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks to everyone for joining us today for this webinar. Special thanks to our technical and media relations staff at Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond, Virginia, Mike Frontiero, whose voice you just heard, Crystal Siegel, and Sam Ziegler. I appreciate all of those who have helped with the publicity for this event, and it's clearly worked with all the folks we have with us today. And a special thanks to the leadership team of the Enoch Seminar for helping to publicize. In the midst of pandemic and all of our global challenges we have been facing, these webinars are a wonderful opportunity for interchange with scholars and interpreters all over the world. They're transforming some of the ways in which we talk about texts and ideas. So I'm grateful for the participation of the panelists, but also of all those who are listening in and who will participate in the conversation. With wisdom and with course can be traced to Augustine linked Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon with Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. We can go, however, and identify a particular type of instructional discourse during some of the earliest periods of ancient Egypt with texts like Tahotep. And everyone wonders what to do with the book of Job. Yet in recent years, some interpreters, including some of those participating in this webinar, have questioned the value of the wisdom designation as a generic category or even a useful descriptor when studying the Bible and related texts. These scholars argue that wisdom is a modern scholarly construct, and nebulous criteria and lack of clarity about the extent of what might be properly called the wisdom corpus should even lead to an obituary for this designation, which has far outlived its usefulness. By insisting on calling certain texts and ideas wisdom, we are perhaps imposing our own agenda. Clarified, claimed that instructional or wisdom literature constitutes one of the oldest and clearest generic types in the ancient world. And the biblical writers of books like Proverbs drew directly from what might properly be called a wisdom tradition. These commentators argue that there is a marked coherence to the category we label wisdom. Often confusion exists to questions of genre. Is there a genre that we may properly call wisdom? If this is not the correct label, what should we call it? Or if it is not a genre, may it reasonably be called a category with a particular worldview, a way of approaching God, world, and humanity, as we apply to the and to the Bible. It seems of genre and category are often unclear, especially since modern interpreters of this material often operate with different and at times competing definitions. Some scholars argue that wisdom is both genre and category worldview. Some argue that it is neither. We are here this afternoon to adjudicate some of these claims with some of the most active and engaging scholars who have taken up this debate. A few points on format. Each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes and lay out certain. Then we will open the floor for questions and hopefully get to most of them. For all of you watching this, whether on YouTube or Facebook, feel free to type in questions as they have you, even when the panelists are speaking. And they will come directly to us as you type. We know many friends are here who are very interested in this topic. And we will also be putting recent publications topic as we speak. So without further ado, we will go to our first panelist, who is Will Kynes. Will, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dr. Adams. I am honored to participate on this panel with scholars who have all shaped my understanding of wisdom literature. Indeed, at the SBL annual meeting in Chicago in 1994, John Collins said something that forever changed the way that I thought about the wisdom literature category. Now, I didn't hear him say it. I was 13 years old at the time and not yet attending SBL meetings, but I heard it secondhand in an article by Sarah Tanzer. Collins observed that wisdom, quote, threatens to become an all-encompassing category. Any form of knowledge that is recognized as good may be dubbed wisdom. And this led me to wonder, who is doing the dubbing and what do they think is good? In this discussion, you'll likely hear various efforts to define and defend some version of the wisdom category, ancient Near Eastern parallels, prototype genre theory appeals to the Solomonic corpus, a coherent tradition of instruction that goes back to Egypt, and so on. If you begin with the presupposition that such a category exists, and that Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and perhaps Job are its prototypical members, then there are a variety of arguments that may be made to justify its existence, though the fact that we're having this discussion draws into question their effectiveness. But should we even begin with that presupposition? In all the debate about how to define the wisdom category over the last century, that question has rarely been asked. The existence of the category was simply assumed. It was a universal consensus, a basic scholarly intuition. Its origins were never carefully investigated. The wisdom category was simply part of the intellectual furniture that we all carried around in our heads. And though we would frequently trip over it, we never thought to ask who put it there and why. So that's what I did. And I found that the wisdom category does not go back to ancient Jewish and Christian interpretation. We find these books grouped in a number of different ways for a number of different reasons, but none that directly parallel the modern wisdom category. Sure, there's the Solomonic corpus, the poetry section in the Greek canon, Josephus's 4 books that contain hymns and instructions. But if these were the same as wisdom literature, why don't they include the same texts? The different contents reflect different criteria, categories quantitatively and qualitatively different from wisdom literature. In fact, we don't see discussion of a distinct wisdom literature corpus, one that includes Job while excluding Song of Songs and Psalms, until 1851, in Wisdom Teaching of the Hebrews, a contribution to the history of philosophy by Johann Bruch. Bruch's contemporaries recognized that he had developed something new. So even if there had been hints of the category earlier, it was his version that shaped subsequent scholarship. And this is where Collins's insight is so important. In 19th century Germany, Christians continued what Kant had identified as their long struggle to present Christianity as a purely moral religion, while also in continuity with Judaism, which Kant claimed was characterized by dogmatic faith, theocratic institutions, legal coercion, and particularistic exclusion. Though Kant claimed Judaism only prepared the way for Christianity after it had been enlightened by Greek thought, Bruch attempted to find this enlightenment within the Old Testament itself. Wisdom literature, as the, quote, universalistic, humanistic, philosophical collection within the Old Testament, as Franz Delitzsch characterized it at the time, was Bruch's effort to resolve Christianity's struggle with its Jewish roots. Though Delitzsch adopted the category from Bruch, he said Bruch was, quote, mistaken in placing wisdom in an indifferent and even hostile relation to the national law and the national cultus, which Bruch compares to the relation of Christian philosophy to Orthodox theology. Even today, independence from Israel's law, cult, and history continue to be a dominant defining feature of wisdom literature. Some of my fellow panelists may even appeal to it. As Roland Murphy claims, the most striking characteristic uniting current definitions of wisdom literature is, quote, the absence of what one normally considers as typically Israelite and Jewish. Why have we chosen to build a category around the absence of Israelite religion? And might this focus have blinded us to the role in these texts of Israel's law, covenants, history, and revelation as they reside in the blurry periphery of our vision? Now, that the traits commonly associated with wisdom literature, universalism, humanism, rationalism, secularism, individualism, skepticism, that they reflect so clearly the post-Enlightenment context in which the category first appeared does not in itself discount the category. But the fact that those scholars dubbed wisdom precisely what they recognized as good should make us suspicious. It sure seems like another example of scholars looking down the well and seeing their own reflections. And the anti-Jewish perspectives shimmering at the bottom of that well are certainly concerning. Now, I doubt any scholars adopt the category for those reasons today, but that doesn't erase their influence. The origins of the wisdom literature category were anything but arbitrary. Recognizing the end or purpose of the category should lead us to consider ending its use. When we add the difficulties in defining and delimiting the category that continue to plague the field, leading to discussions like this one, then the case for taking this mental furniture to the curb gets even stronger. Wisdom literature is not dead because it's a modern construct, but because it's a modern construct that distorts rather than illuminates, as it imposes a modern worldview on ancient texts. And this power to distort interpretation is why I would suggest we should care about this issue. Too often, we allow the category to do the interpretive work for us, such as when Michael Fox claims that land in Proverbs 2:21 refers to this world and not the land of Israel because, quote, concern for the land of Israel is absent from biblical wisdom literature. But dispensing with a category like this is difficult. I know. I've had to rename and completely redesign my wisdom literature class, and I'm no longer sure how to describe my specialty, the books formerly known as wisdom literature. Plus, what about all these theories about the wise in Israel, schools, and scribalism, and wisdom theology? But the wisdom category is simply too weak a foundation for the speculative, historical, and theological superstructures built upon it. It's far better to be able to say less that can actually be supported by the evidence than a lot more that cannot. And we don't have to stop talking about the concept of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible and beyond, or even stop comparing the so-called wisdom books to one another. Wisdom is a major theme in all three books, and 1 Kings 1-11, and must be discussed in their interpretation. But they're not wisdom literature in any definitive categorical sense that would justify the assumption that they were composed in a separate school with a distinctive theology that requires its own introductions, specialists, or conference sessions, any more than grouping texts based on their interest in other concepts, such as righteousness or holiness would. We can also continue to investigate the similarities between Egyptian instructions, Proverbs, Sirach, and other instructional literature, including Deuteronomy. We don't need the wisdom category to do that. In fact, we can even do this work better with greater accuracy without carrying along all the poorly packed baggage of the wisdom category. Developments in genre theory are pushing the field in this direction anyway, away from taxonomic categories which attempt to determine what a text is. Instead, genres are increasingly seen as dynamic groupings that identify salient features shared by groups of texts as perceived by culturally contextualized readers. Combining those perspectives will diffuse the influence of any interpretive bias, mine included, I hope, and offer a fuller, three-dimensional understanding, as texts are read at the intersection of multiple genre groupings rather than in a single genre category. Burying the 19th century wisdom literature category as the genre category of these texts will enable new perspectives on Israelite wisdom and the so-called wisdom books to bloom.
Thanks very much, Will, for those insightful remarks that were sure to lead us into some engaging discussion. We will now move to John Collins. John, the floor is yours.
I may have said that in 1994. I really don't remember. Now, it seems to me there are two issues in dispute. What do we mean by a genre? And are the books commonly designated as wisdom literature? Should I say formally designated as wisdom literature? Profitably grouped together. After reading Will's monograph, I'm not entirely clear on his response to the second question. He declares boldly in his conclusion that the wisdom literature category is dead, leaving us to wonder what the recent Oxford Handbook of Wisdom and the Bible is about, or did the death of wisdom occur more recently? At other times, he seems to be saying that wisdom literature is one of several ways that these books can be categorized, and that his objection is to placing any book exclusively in that category. In that case, the obituary would seem to be unnecessary and unwarranted. The category may be relativized, but it isn't necessarily dead. But let us start with the question of genre. The discussion of genre in relation to wisdom literature is confused because scholars use the word with different meanings and talk at cross purposes. For most of my career, I have taken genre as a literary designation and literary form as an important marker. The current trend seems to be towards a very broad use of genre for any kind of grouping of texts. At one point, Will speaks of texts grouped together because they share one or more features, and insists that any text can be categorized in multiple ways. Now, I agree that genres are not objective entities, but are constructed by readers for their purposes, and are in fact constructed in different ways. I also agree that texts may participate in more than one genre and may overlap. But if we use the term genre for any group of texts that share anything in common, we're in danger of emptying it of any significance. As traditionally used, a genre is not just a group of texts, but a kind of writing to which certain kinds of meaning are appropriate. Will cites, very helpfully, John Frow on how genres are necessary as a restraint on semiosis that distinguishes the types of meaning that are more relevant and appropriate in a given context and therefore more probable. They create a horizon of expectations to orient the reader's understanding. But not all features that two texts may have in common function in this way. As John Barton has commented, the significance of genre is often shown most clearly by genre mistakes, such as missing a joke or taking a fable or a symbolic vision as historical fact. Popular interpretation of the Bible is littered with such genre mistakes, from the story of Adam and Eve to the Apocalypse. And the clarification of different genres is one of the major achievements of modern scholarship. Barton, incidentally, cites wisdom literature as one of the genres that most biblical students have the competence to recognize. To speak of genre in this sense is admittedly to speak at a broader level than to speak of genres as defined by literary form, say tragedy or the TV sitcom. I do not see this as a problem. Genres can be meaningful on different levels. Fiction is a kind of writing, but it can be expressed in a wide range of different literary genres. But even on the more specific level, a genre is still a kind of writing. The expectations appropriate to science fiction are different from those of realistic novels, and so forth. It may be helpful to distinguish meta-genres on the broader level, but in any case, we should recognize that there are different levels of genre, whatever we may call them. I do not know of any scholar, biblical or other, who has claimed that texts should only be compared with works of the same genre. Any two texts can be put in conversation, so to speak. But this does not necessarily mean that they are the same kind of text. It should be obvious that literary genres change over time. Some 40 years ago, Alistair Fowler wrote about the life and death of literary forms, and H.H. Schmid wrote about Wesen und Geschichte der Weisheit. Genres are not static entities. Any discussion of genre must of necessity recognize some common features in the texts that are grouped together. Nonetheless, there is widespread resistance in recent discussions to precise classification and definition. In part, this is due to the appreciation of the fact that many texts have affinities with more than one genre, and also that each text is in some way distinctive. Consequently, the tendency in more recent criticism has been towards emphasizing generic fluidity and fuzzy boundaries. Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance is often invoked. I do not find that very satisfactory. As John Swales put it, family resemblance can make anything resemble anything. But prototype theory is much more helpful, I think, because it allows for prototypes that focus the discussion while also recognizing fuzzy edges with examples that resemble the prototype in some respects, but diverge in others. I think some scholars who speak of family resemblance seem to have something more like prototype theory in mind, and I think Catherine Dell actually would provide an example of that, since she talks of family resemblance, but still I believe, accepts a wisdom core represented by Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, or at least did so a few years ago. If we approach the wisdom literature from this perspective, the prototypical text is Proverbs. Other wisdom texts are so identified because of their similarity to Proverbs. The similarity is primarily formal. Proverbs is instructional literature. Much of the book, in chapters 10 to 30, consists of proverbial sayings. The first 9 chapters contain longer discourses. All of this material consists either of direct speech or declarative sentences. This style of presentation is distinctive in the biblical corpus. Narrative elements play a minor role. The prophetic books also use direct address extensively, but the tone is very different from that of Proverbs, and prophetic speech differs in its reliance on divine authority. Even when the sayings in Proverbs are couched as imperatives, they do not have the force of law. Proverbial sayings can, of course, be found in prophetic and narrative books, but they do not determine the character of these other genres. Like Proverbs, Kohelet consists entirely of declarative sentences and direct address, and mixes longer instructions with collections of sayings. It does not correspond to Proverbs in all details, but it is clearly closer to Proverbs in style and manner of presentation than to any other book in the biblical corpus. While there are only 2 examples of the genre so defined or described in the Hebrew Bible, they stand in continuity with a long line of Near Eastern, especially Egyptian wisdom instructions, and the tradition is continued in Ben Sira and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The continuity between Egyptian instructional literature and Proverbs also rests primarily in the manner of presentation, although more specific points of contact may also be noted. So, for example, Nili Shupak writes that Egyptian wisdom consists of 2 subgenres, didactic and speculative. Insofar as the book of Job is a dialogue with a narrative framework, it is more distant from Proverbs. The speeches of Job's friends are essentially wisdom instructions, but I think we might locate Job on the fuzzy edge of the wisdom genre, but it is not a prototypical example. The wisdom literature so conceived is a kind of writing, characterized by observation and advice. It grounds its authority in the inherited wisdom of fathers and teachers, even if the distillation of that appearance sometimes hardens into dogma, and even if it sometimes incorporates wisdom derived ultimately from revelation. This is true even of skeptical books like Kohelet, because the questions, the wisdom still provides the framework for discussion. Despite Crenshaw's famous dictum about a marriage between form and content, the instruction genre is not tied to a particular worldview, but can draw on whatever worldview happens to be prevalent. This has become clear from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and should have been clear anyway from the Wisdom of Solomon. This does not mean that a genre can never be identified on the basis of a worldview, but that is not the basis for identifying wisdom instruction as a genre. Wisdom instructions may still be related to texts that are not cast as instructions in manifold ways. A good example is provided by the relation of Proverbs to Deuteronomy. Stuart Weeks has argued that it is difficult to read Proverbs 1 to 9 without rapidly becoming aware of its strong affinities with the language of Deuteronomy. These affinities, I think, are undeniable. Proverbs 6:20 refers to the commandment of the father and the Torah of the mother, and similar echoes of Deuteronomy can be found in the wisdom instructions in Proverbs 3 and 7. Stuart continues, early readers clearly believed that the instruction commended in Proverbs 1 to 9 should be identified with the Deuteronomic Torah, and it is very likely that the work itself intended such an identification. But in fact, Proverbs never refers to the Torah of Moses or of Yahweh, but to the teaching and instructions of parents and or the sage. Its authority derives from human teachers. That authority may be enhanced by association with the Torah of Deuteronomy, but it does not derive from it. To read Proverbs through the lens of Deuteronomy, it seems to me, taking its Torah as covenantal law rather than parental instruction, is either a genre mistake or a reinterpretation. Similarly, to characterize Proverbs along with prophecy as inspired instruction for righteous living, one of the options that Will suggests is, I think, either a genre mistake or a reinterpretation. Proverbs does not claim inspiration. It is not the same kind of text as Amos or Ezekiel, even though the Proverbs can also use Proverbs for their purposes. The difference in kind between Proverbs and Deuteronomy, or between Proverbs and prophecy, brings us back to the metacritical questions with which Will begins his book. As he helpfully remarks, the metacritic is not immune from metacriticism. Two things strike me about his project on the metacritical level. One is the evident nostalgia for pre-critical interpretation. He notes that the distinction of wisdom literature as a separate category developed in Germany in the wake of the Enlightenment, along with an interest in universalism and a tendency to secularism. Were these bad things that should somehow discredit wisdom as a category? The other thing that strikes me is the constant complaint that treating wisdom literature as a separate category separates it from the canon. Similarly, comparison of Proverbs and Koheleth with ancient Near Eastern wisdom has contributed to the eclipse of canonical connections. Are canonical connections somehow to be preferred? I wonder whether Will's objections to treating wisdom literature as a distinct category do not arise from theological rather than literary considerations. If the reading of books like Proverbs and Koheleth has been distorted in biblical scholarship, and it surely has sometimes, I would submit that the greatest distorting factor is not the category of wisdom literature, but the canon, and the assumption that all parts of the canon are the same kind of literature. Perhaps it is time we had an obituary for the canon. In his introductory chapter, Will offered another metacritical comment that I found enlightening when he related his monograph to a contemporary genre of end of books, of which Francis Fukuyama's The End of History may serve as the prototype. It should by now, I think, be obvious that Fukuyama's book was spectacularly wrong, even if we accept the reduction of history to ideological conflict communism. The title of his book, and the trademark of the genre of which it is a prototype, is rhetorical hyperbole, which is a very good way to get attention. But history did not end in 1989, and the category wisdom literature is not dead in 2021. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Collins. And if you are like me, you will definitely want to hear a response from Will Kynes. I promise there will be time for that in our conversation. We appreciate this lively discussion, but we have, and again, feel free to type questions as they come. I would also point out that in this age of multiple platforms for social media, we are also having some live tweeting going on, hashtag wisdom webinar, capitalize both W's. So if you want to get into that as we proceed, please do. Our next speaker is Catherine Dell. Catherine, the floor is yours, and I want to offer a special word of thanks for Catherine Dell and Stuart Weeks for joining us at a much later hour across the pond in the UK. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel, and it's already proving lively, so I'm very glad to be here. Well, it seems appropriate to open my talk with a proverb. By wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. Proverbs 24:7. This is the basic form of wisdom, the sometimes one line, but mainly two line parallelistic maxim. usually containing some point of contrast, designed to teach and illuminate some facet of our world. This basic form characterizes wisdom, and some proverbs, such as this one, contain the word wisdom, hokmah, a word that occurs 39 times in the book of Proverbs alone, with the adjective wise, hakam, occurring 47 times, as Wybrave famously counted up. We also have the female figure of wisdom in Proverbs, Proverbs 1:20-33, 3:13-20, and chapter 8, consolidating the didactic exercise with a poetic and theological image that gives cohesion to the book and its themes, notably that of creation. I regard the book of Proverbs then as the starting point for this category of wisdom, avoiding further categories of wisdom literature, wisdom tradition, and so on for now. For if we didn't have Proverbs, I don't believe we would have a wisdom category at all. The book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon more than once, 1:1, 10:1, and I maintain that there is significance in that attribution, even if Solomon didn't simply sit down and write it. More of that later. I want to frame this talk within my own wisdom journey, quite appropriate since wisdom's path of learning is a frequent picture. Whoever heeds instruction is on the path to life, reads Proverbs 10:17. But, the usual point of contrast, one who rejects a rebuke goes astray. Well, for me, it started 33 years ago with my doctoral work on the book of Job, published as the Book of Job as Skeptical Literature. As part of that work, I became increasingly aware of Job's lack of fit into the wisdom literature category. Of course, that largely rested on how one defines the category in the first place, be that broadly, like von Rad's An Approach to Reality, or more narrowly, taking a viewpoint that looked mainly at the smaller genres being used in the wisdom books, such as proverbs, vignettes of autobiographical narrative, instruction texts. It seemed to me that Job was an outsider, its genre of dialogue being absent from other wisdom books, and its heavy emphasis on lament, resembling the Psalms more closely than its so-called wisdom literature companions. Whilst I concluded that Job might have been written by a renegade sage or a skeptic on the edge of the tradition, I emphasized the author's parodying of psalmic laments and the distance of the book from usual wisdom classifications. Using Ecclesiastes as a control, a book often paired with Job as wisdom in revolt, to use Purdue's phrase, I found many more mainstream wisdom genres in that book, the use of proverbs for citation, autobiographical narrative, and so on, rather than elsewhere. Despite the questioning nature of Ecclesiastes, it seemed to be working more closely from the wisdom already known to us from Proverbs. This is not to say that Job is not about thematic issues that concern the writers of both books, such as the doctrine of retribution in the dialogue, and an emphasis on creation in the God speeches of Job 38-42, and indeed on wisdom in Job 28. But in relation to genre classification, which involved not only forms, but also detailed conclusions about content and context involving sages at the courts of kings, it seemed that Job failed as wisdom literature on a number of counts. This unease with traditional categorization drew me towards looking for what is generally termed wisdom influence in other books, with the thought that if Job broke outside these wisdom literature boundaries, what about, first, other material that was often put into the same category, but also seemed to strain its borders? One thinks perhaps of wisdom psalms in the Psalter. And second, books that seemed in a different genre area, such as prophecy, but in fact showed wisdom elements to a greater or lesser degree, thinking perhaps of Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and so on. Again, there were problems of definition. Was I looking simply for smaller genres of wisdom within the pages of other books? Or was I looking for grand wisdom themes running through them? Was I looking for didacticism, the motivation to teach and learn? Or was the link much broader, such as simply the doctrine of creation being aired, or concerns about human suffering being brought out? Or was I even looking for paradigms of wise men, Joseph perhaps, or Daniel, or for those elusive sages or scribes? This opened up the floodgates for looking at other texts, and whilst wisdom still seems something distinctive to be looking for in those texts, in relation to genres, themes, and social contexts, the texts varied in the ways they related to the core, which I took to be Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, with Job on the side. It was when I turned my attention to the Song of Songs that I started to get more interested in the link with Solomon. The Song of Songs possibly containing a wisdom redaction in the more maxim-like statements such as love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave, with the opening parallelistic injunction to set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, 8:6. But in general, regarded as love songs when it comes to genre classification. Of particular interest seemed to be the attribution to Solomon, and not merely the attribution, but the other references that brought him to mind. A king figure, to a possible wedding, including the elaborate palanquin, and even possibly a Solomonic or kingly role play between the lovers. This suggested that the Solomonic link was not accidental, but was rather more embedded in the text. This same observation applied to Ecclesiastes with its Solomonic attribution, albeit veiled, in 1:1 and 1:12, and its accompanying Solomonic autobiography in 1:12 to 2:24. Job again seemed the outsider, with even Proverbs containing Solomonic attributions, including to the officials of King Hezekiah, who copied Solomon's Proverbs in Proverbs 25:1. This suggested that it was time to turn to the Solomon narratives in 1 Kings 1 to 11. Amongst all the problems of this description in 1 Kings, its elaborate nature, its idealization of Solomon after the event, its Deuteronomic shaping, and so on, this account of Solomon's wisdom, described as very great wisdom, discernment and breadth of understanding as vast as the sand on the seashore, 4:28, seemed to be the magnet holding the wisdom phenomenon together. This seemed to work better than the various categorizations. Wisdom literature, very much a literary-based description. Wisdom tradition, pretty much relying on the edifice of an elaborate reconstruction of the scribal social context. Even wisdom influence, which I had already shown, was a muddy category at best. The text of Kings itself stated that Solomon composed 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005, 4:31. And his interest in nature and animals and all items related to the created world seemed to make the vital links with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes as the wisdom core that other texts did not make. And so I developed a theory of family relationship with Proverbs, Ecclesiastes as core, Song of Songs as a close relative, Job as a more distant cousin, and so on. The analogy was simply to show the complex nature of these intertextual relationships, which, as I'd shown in earlier work, tended to simply grow and grow. So my most recent book, the Solomonic Corpus of Wisdom and its Influence, brings together past articles and adds 3 new ones, combining all this thinking on the wisdom phenomenon with Solomon at the center. To quote from the blurb, Solomon is the embodiment of wisdom, thus linking the narrative portrayal and the canonical memory of his significance. My book, though, adds an extra dimension to this categorization of wisdom, which is the element of intertextuality. This method of study has shown us that not only can we range texts together that seem to have similarities, be it forms, themes, or contextual factors, But we can expand that further into looking at more distant texts and discovering connections, even texts that seem on the face of it to have nothing much in common. So I discovered, for example, a rhetorical didactic type of intertextuality of Ruth with Proverbs, in which Ruth is portrayed as a wisdom ideal, displaying moral qualities found in Proverbs. I revisited a theological intertextuality between Ecclesiastes and Genesis 1 to 11, and I looked at fresh thematic intertexts between the Song of Songs and material beyond, mainly in prophetic texts, on the themes of garden and water, relating intertextually to the Garden of Eden in Genesis, but also to the Garden of the Lord. Well, it's probably time for me to wrap up. I believe there is a basic phenomenon called wisdom and a valuable category there, but that there are different ways to view certain conglomerations of texts and hence of categorizing them. I like Will Kine's idea in his book of viewing different patterns of constellations, which also helps to bring out the subjective nature of reading texts and of deciding how to classify them. Because, of course, the constellations are in the eye of the beholder. A generic approach is not dead for me. Hence, I won't be writing any obituaries, but an intertextual one is opening up new vistas of possibility and casting the Solomonic wisdom net wider than ever. Have we lost Sam?
I think we've got Sam somewhere along the line.
Oh, okay.
Is he coming back in? Or
Well, should you just start?
will I just go? Okay. Right, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm sitting in my front room rather than in my study because my 16-year-old is trying to get to sleep upstairs, so I need to be a little quiet. What it does mean, though, is that I'm not surrounded by my normal collection of academic books. All these books you can see behind me are fiction. I've got, well, particularly perhaps detective fiction. I've got some Victorian fiction. Got Chester Himes over there, which is black fiction and detective fiction. I've got some science fiction. These are labels. Some of the books can be labeled in a number of different ways. They're 19th century novels, and they're detective fiction, and they're fiction by women. The labels that we use depend on the questions we're asking. If I want to examine 19th century fiction, then yes, I could go around my shelves and classify the things that are 19th century fiction, the things that are novels, the things that are collections of short stories. Genre labels are not inherent. They can be, and this is why genre is such a difficult term. If someone writes a limerick according to a very specific form, or writes a sonnet, then that can be described as a genre as well. But an awful lot of the genre labels that we use are simply labels of convenience, labels that allow us to group texts according to the particular questions that we want to ask of them. Those might be questions about date, they might be questions about authorship, they might be questions about content, they might be questions about form. But they are things that come from us and are projected essentially onto the books. So I think the real question that we need to ask about wisdom literature is whether that term helps us to answer any questions that we've got, not whether it's something that's inherent in the works themselves. Now, I'm not sure, and I'm genuinely agnostic on this, whether that's the case. It is true that, I've been writing an article on Ecclesiastes this afternoon. I have spent a lot of time referring to Proverbs and referring to Job. It is clear that a lot of the things I want to examine in Ecclesiastes find their closest parallels, the closest discussions in those books. But I'm also very, very aware that all of those books take very different forms. And I think I need to stress this. I mean, John earlier mentioned that Kohelet was entirely declarative. There isn't an admonition in Ecclesiastes until the 5th chapter. There are virtually no individual sayings or aphorisms in Ecclesiastes until very late in the book. And they're mostly gathered in chapters 7 and 1 or 2 other places. This is not a book that looks like Proverbs. If you only had the first 4 chapters of Ecclesiastes, that is not the connection you would make. I don't think that wisdom literature lends itself to the idea that we are dealing with things like limericks or sonnets with fixed forms. What it does do is lend itself to some much, much broader general ideas of shared interests. It is in the wisdom literature, as it's traditionally been identified, that we find most of the interest in humanity, in the human situation within the world, the human situation relative to God. And that is why it is often useful to bring these books together to talk about them. But whether the authors themselves actually thought that they were writing something like those other books, I'm much less convinced about. There are ancient genres, there are ancient things comparable to our limericks or sonnets. And we have instructions where, frankly, the only thing that really links them is their form of presentation, someone passing on their knowledge to the next generation. We have collections of sayings, but they are harder to define than that. Most of these collections of sayings look very different from each other. The sayings can be different lengths, the sayings can be different forms, some of them can be admonitions, some of them not. It's very loose. So, wisdom literature as a label, I think is handy, but if we attach real significance to it, I think we're actually going down a rabbit hole, and a very unhelpful one. It is often, if we're talking in formal terms, much more useful to say that something is instructional literature, or that it is aphoristic sentence literature. More than that, it is often more useful to say this thing resembles something in Proverbs than to say that it is wisdom literature. And this is where I have my greatest concerns about the use of the label. It can obscure more direct, more precise connections under the veil of something that is unhelpfully vague. This is not confined to wisdom literature. Prophetic literature, one could raise exactly the same problems. How is Jonah prophetic literature? It's basically a story with what? One line of prophecy in it? Apocalyptic literature. Do we want to say that Enoch is the same as Revelation? And I won't invite John to comment on that in detail. The labels that we use are handy in certain respects when we all know roughly what we mean by them. But the moment that we start to push them, the moment that we start to see them as indicating something precise, some shared ambition or shared quality, we run into, I think, very great problems. I don't want to look around my shelves and say that every book there by a black writer has to have the same opinion. If I'm using a label, black fiction, it's not an indication of opinion. It's simply an indication of authorship, which may be convenient for certain investigations. 19th century novels have certain things in common, many things that they do not have in common. So ultimately, I think the problem is not the label wisdom literature, but the significance that we in our discipline attach to labels. We see them as conveying far more meaning than they actually usually have. And they are usually, if not our invention, the invention of some previous generation. They are not an invention of the author. In short, I'm very, very happy to keep using the wisdom literature label. It saves me changing an awful lot of curriculum sheets and things. For teaching purposes, it's handy. Sometimes for writing purposes, it's handy. But it's the significance with which we endow that label that troubles me.
Thank you very much, Stuart Weeks, for your insightful comments, and again for joining us at this late hour across the pond. I want to apologize. Of course, my connection went out right at the moment we were making a transition, but grateful to Stuart for jumping in. So our last panelist is Dr. Jacqueline Weintraub, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. So much has been said today about the value or utility of wisdom as an evaluative category for certain biblical texts, how this category might or might not help us make sense of ancient genres or networks of literary forms. I would like to back up a bit. As biblical scholars, we expend much theorizing energy on sorting and categorizing texts. Indeed, I would say we are addicted to it. This makes sense given the broad task of higher criticism. The task of higher criticism is to interrogate the authorial and historical claims made by the biblical texts. For example, to not take at face value the claim that a text was written by a King Solomon or a King David, and to instead examine the composite nature of our texts. Then we will engage analytical and categorizing frameworks that are distinct from those frameworks given by the texts themselves. And let me just state the obvious here that I assent to these fundamental higher critical tasks. Indeed, I often believe they do not go far enough, but that is for another discussion. Now, as Annette Reed recently reminded me, this impulse to categorize and generate definitions of texts offers a veil of objectivity, when in actuality, this veil of objectivity obscures our own interference as scholars. It obscures who we are in our interface with the texts, and it obscures, or at times reveals, our varied political, intellectual, or theological commitments, whatever they may be. And in this sense, a number of today's panelists have helpfully reminded us of the constructed nature of such categories, and the very fact that these categories must be seen from their own historical context as scholarly inventions. Of course, the question then remains, once we have observed the subjectivity and constructedness of the categories we habitually use to think about these texts, what emerges from the wreckage? How are we to proceed? But to return briefly to the observation of the categorizing and definition generating work of biblical scholarship, much of biblical scholarship seems to be devoted to questions of whether any given text is a this or a that. Can a narrative text be wisdom? Do we include some Psalms but not Song of Songs? Is this text wisdom, or is it prophecy, or is it something else? It must be pointed out that one variation of the categorizing impulse is to evaluate the interrelationship between texts. For example, does Ecclesiastes look more like Proverbs or Job? Is Ben Sira responding more to Proverbs or to Ecclesiastes? What does Ruth share with Proverbs 31? This mode of inquiry can be used to diachronic ends, establishing the relative dates of two or more texts based on their perceived relationship to one another. Or it can take a synchronic approach to further expand or contract established generic categories in the biblical corpus. There's no inherent flaw to such projects. To date texts relatively to one another, to propose a historical scheme for the development of a series of texts, or to discern a generic prototype from which to categorize texts, for example, though all such projects risk certain methodological errors. Just to give some examples of the flaws entailed in these projects. For example, the diachronic project, questions like, is Proverbs older than Ecclesiastes? More often than not, superimpose an evolutionist scheme of how literary forms and culture develops. Sometimes such schemes assume a shorter text necessarily precedes a longer text, or that a conceptually simpler text precedes a more complex one. And a synchronic project can take the biblical author's literary claims at face value, assuming that a text that is labeled or categorized in one way by biblical authors or editors is necessarily a valid representation of that category. And indeed, both can elicit a skewed picture of what a literary culture looked like by assuming that our available evidence is the total picture of what existed in antiquity, as opposed to the fragmentary reality of our access to the past. But oftentimes, when one is consumed by asking the question of how does this text look like other texts or groups of texts, another equally important question is obscured. What does this text do with its words? That is to say, how does this text arrange its words to shape or subvert expectations an ancient audience might have? This is precisely the sort of question I would like to pose of several texts that we tend to evaluate within the wisdom framework. I will not do so to reinforce the boundaries of the category or to demonstrate their relationship to one another, but rather to show how even beyond the framework of the wisdom category, we can identify the ancient debates, values, or arenas of thought in which these texts participate. Looking briefly at Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Ben Sira, and moving from the more formal to the more thematic, I will identify three distinguishable arenas in which these texts operate. First, collection versus composition. The second, the mechanics of advice giving. And third, the possibility of posterity. The first arena in which these three texts participate, and one could consider for any biblical or non-biblical text for that matter, is the question of whether the text is a collection or a composition. While this might seem to be a very general consideration, if one considers all three texts carefully, one sees that the answer is not clear-cut. Indeed, all three texts in different ways seem to straddle both collection and composition, and even elicit an anxiety about how the reader should think about the text as a whole. Ancient Near Eastern instruction texts, notably Egyptian instruction texts and the few Mesopotamian examples we have, seem to resolve this anxiety with a clear narrative of instruction frame. The bits of advice, at times disparate bits of advice, are collected together, but framed as the cohesive speech of a renowned figure of knowledge, imparting this advice to the subsequent generation. I would even include here Hammurabi's so-called code as a collection of cases that are brought together within the speech of the king as disseminator and embodiment of justice. The spoken composition evokes what Timothy Hogue has called a socially formative voice, that these first-person speeches, quote, create a sense of authoritative orality, which was materialized in ways meant to also evoke or replace iconicity. That's to say, the named speaker stands in for the socially formative figure who speaks with authority. Unlike in the somewhat varied ancient Near Eastern literary presentations, this anxiety of the spoken composition versus the unframed text, or the primarily textually framed collection, remains unresolved in Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Ben Sira, but this anxiety manifests differently in each of these texts. In Proverbs, Solomon is not explicitly the framed speaker of any of the texts, and indeed, as we see in the somewhat different arrangement in the Septuagint, the anxiety of Proverbs as a collection with a variety of titular figures named or unnamed was perceived and in some ways attempted to be resolved in antiquity. In Ecclesiastes, we might say that we have an unambiguous composition on our hands, but at the same time, the speaker of this composition is missing the crucial component of identification in Israel's literary lore. Who indeed is this Kohelet? For the collected advice to be efficacious, its eponymous speaker must be renowned for their success, such as we see from other ancient Near Eastern advice-giving contexts. And to rub it in the epilogue of Ecclesiastes, we are told by a framed speaker that this otherwise unknown Kohelet was a great collector, tester, and teacher of sayings. Are these then to now be understood not as his words of personal experience, but the collection of sayings he picked up elsewhere? Certainly not, but the anxiety is reintroduced at this point in any case. And in Ben Sira, the question of its form as a composition is wrapped up in both his self-identification as a teacher and the possibility of his posterity. Though I do not have time to delve into the further details, we see that the arenas of the mechanics of advice giving as a representation of social action dependent upon the reputation of the purported speaker, the promised results of the advice, are likewise connected to the possibility of posterity, the name, the enduring reputation of the speaker that is extended to the authority and authenticity of the text bearing the speaker's name and the anticipated reception of the text itself within the library. Because these texts are self-consciously speech, whose efficacy as speech, as advice, is linked to the name and reputation of the speaker, they involve the overlapping arenas of concern that I briefly mentioned: collection versus composition, how directly connected the speech is to the speaker; the mechanics of advice giving, the transmission of knowledge, its social expectations and its promises; and the possibility of posterity, how the words live on in their connection to a named figure. Would I use the category of wisdom? Sure, with the caveats of acknowledging its limitations, its constructedness, the baggage it brings with the history of usage and the discipline. Can we find ways of characterizing texts and their relationships to one another that allows us to peer beyond the artificiality and limitations of the wisdom category? I think so. If pressed to offer an overarching description of these texts, I might describe them as authoritative advice giving. In sum, scholars create categories inductively so that they can be used deductively. Their artificial nature is erased and they are reified. But this is not to say that what we include within a wisdom category cannot be repurposed, provided we begin with the poetics of the texts, with the question of what do the texts do with their words? My suggestion is to begin with questions of pragmatics and poetics, not questions of genre and category. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Weintraub and all the other panelists. We do have some time for questions, and if you have not asked one yet in the chat platform, I'm gonna one of the first questions across comes from Charles Comerford, and I'm gonna ask that sort of as an overarching question, and this will also give the panelists a chance to respond to each other a bit. So if the argument is made, as John Collins did and others have, that instruction is the main feature that unites what we often call wisdom literature, would it not be more prudent to refer to this as instructional literature, and so perhaps develop a more specific generic category that doesn't necessarily come with all the scholarly baggage that the wisdom literature label carries? So anybody can jump in. Well, and it's because this gets Weintraub's authoritative advice given. Is it just a wisdom that's the problem? Should we just call it something else? And would that help solve the problem? I guess is what a lot of discussions into. So, but I think I will take facilitator's prerogative because he was, his scholarship has been discussed. I will give Kine's first response at that question.
Yes. So I just want to thank all the panelists. I just was fantastic. Thanks for your insight. So I would really be interested to hear Dr. Collins address this issue, particularly the question of both he and you, Sam, pointed out there are these clear connections between Egyptian instructions and then Proverbs and Sirach, and that's great. And I think that we can actually look at those connections more clearly if we just look at those connections. And as Stuart was kind of alluding to, not import all of this other stuff from this vague category into that discussion. So what do you see, Dr. Collins, that wisdom literature is giving you that you wouldn't have just by looking more carefully at those connections between those texts?
I think, okay. I think if I were speaking about a genre, I would probably be more comfortable speaking of the instruction as a genre. Now, wisdom is a looser category, and traditionally it brings in things like Job. I think if you look at this, from the prototype perspective, so that you have some things out there on the periphery, okay, that's well enough with that. I'm not particularly invested if it became conventional to speak of instructional literature rather than wisdom literature. That wouldn't bother me. I wouldn't. But while I have you, Will, could you just clarify for me? Are you saying that these books cannot profitably be grouped together at all, or are you just saying that is your objection to doing it exclusively in one way?
Yeah, so an important
More in common in the latter case.
Yeah, thanks for this opportunity to clarify, because this is a common confusion that I've encountered with the book. So I try in the introduction to distinguish genre being used as a category, so in a taxonomic way, saying that's what this text is, from dynamic genre groupings. So that's just saying I, as a reader, can look at these connections, and I think Stuart gave us some good examples of that in his section. And the objection I have is to wisdom literature as a category, with the scare quotes, like in the title of my book, because as a category, it becomes the foundation for all of these speculations about the historical context of this wisdom movement and their distinctive theology and so forth and so on. And when we say this text is wisdom literature, or this is the dominant feature of this text, then it does lead us to focus on the connections between those texts and miss some of those connections with other texts, not only within the canon, but even beyond the canon. It creates this echo chamber. And both Catherine and Stuart have pointed to this in their work a number of times, and I thought in very helpful ways.
Does anybody else want to jump in on this question of instructionals?
I mean, I think the issue, going back to the original question, is that we already have a genre, instructional literature, which is narrower in scope, and which does seem broadly to have been recognized in the ancient world. I mean, the issue then is what we do if we say something is instructional literature. I mean, a book that I've worked on quite a lot is Tobit, where on 2 occasions, Tobit bursts into classic instructional literature. The father passing on advice to his son. But that doesn't mean that Tobit is instructional literature. It just means that instructional literature is a secondary genre within the book of Tobit. I've got an Agatha Christie up there that has a railway timetable in it, but I wouldn't use it to get to London. And I think that we need to recognize that quite a lot of instructional literature and aphoristic literature is used in this way as a secondary genre within other texts. And this has been a big problem in the whole question of wisdom influence, because biblical scholarship has been very bad at recognizing secondary genres and very bad at saying if a text is one genre, it can't contain another. And I think that's something that we do need to face head on. I mean, I've been working a lot on Ecclesiastes. It does contain aphoristic literature, but it isn't aphoristic literature. The epilogue of Ecclesiastes uses the my son address, which is typical of instructional literature, but neither the epilogue nor the work as a whole are instructional literature. This is where we need to be so careful about what we mean by genre. We can take black hats and white hats in cowboy films as a genre marker. But that doesn't mean that whenever we see a white hat in a detective film or a thriller or any other kind of movie, that we need to read the same things across into that work.
I mean, I might, if I could jump in here, I might add that it also leads us again to the question of, why are we asking the question about genre? What is its purpose? What do we gain from asking that question that we could not, not that it, would it be better for us to ask a question about what are the audience expectations? Not, is this a this and does it contain a that within it? But rather, what kinds of ancient audience expectations do we have for, I don't know, a railway timetable? And how does that work within this, the particular narrative to evoke some kind of expectation, or how does it subvert an expectation? I think that those kinds of questions lead us down more fruitful paths than saying like, okay, I can put all of these things in column A and then this one goes in column B, and then I wonder, what do we have? We just have 2 columns. So yeah, I would sort of add that.
Absolutely.
There was a question here. I wanted to, gotta find it here. There was a question about Job, but there was also a question for Catherine Dell specifically, and now I can't find it. Does somebody see it? It's the what do you mean by interbiblical? Oh, interbiblical and intertextual. Just to clarify that.
Well, that is actually that is a big question. Inner biblical would be simply restricted to biblical texts generally within the canon. Intertextual probably would have a broader remit. So on an intertext, I could be talking about anything, from Agatha Christie to Shakespeare to whatever. I mean, I think that's generally perceived to be one of the main differences. So inner biblical would be a more canonical reference.
Thank you for that. We have some other questions coming through. Here's one that just came through. Does not the giver of instruction need wisdom in order to be worthy of providing wisdom? Could we be better suited to have another category for biblical literature that doesn't fit this label? I guess that gets to the whole issue of authority to provide wisdom and the way this shows up, usually under the banner of Solomon. Anybody want to respond to that? Go ahead, John. Unmute though.
Am I muted? Oh yeah. I think it would be better to separate the discussion of wisdom as an attribute from the question of genre. You can get wise people in anything. But while I have the floor, I had a question for Stuart. You said that if you only had the first 4 chapters of Ecclesiastes, you wouldn't think of Proverbs. What would you think of?
Honestly, nothing. I don't think the first 4 chapters of Ecclesiastes look like anything else. And I think we need to be careful here. There is the form critical commentaries on the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
I think Murphy did the Ecclesiastes one of that, in which he declares its form to be sui generis. It is a unique form, which is a wholly meaningless statement. And I think that this is really important. Not everything looks like something else. If I sit down and read Ulysses, it reminds me of no other novel I've ever read. It is sui generis. There are works like this. Now, it is possible that we've lost other works that looked like this. And it is true that in a very broad sense, the beginning of Ecclesiastes looks like certain memoirs that we've got. But I think that forcing things into a category, inventing a category to contain things when there's only one of them, is a wholly pointless exercise.
Well, Stuart, what about though? I mean, point has been made a couple of times, and Job has come up a few times in the questions. How is it invention if you see in the responses of Job's friends language about God, retribution, act, and consequence that are quite similar to what if not identical, they're not identical, but similar to what we find in Proverbs, making that correlation, making that connection, and calling it Whether we call it authoritative advice giving, instructional discourse, or wisdom matters less to me that we make that link. That doesn't seem to me to be this exercise at all.
I think this gets into the area that Catherine was talking about of intertextuality, but more as it is conceived within the postmodernists movement than the way we normally do it within biblical studies. I mean, I can say that Ulysses looks like no other novel I know, but I'm perfectly clear that Joyce couldn't have written it without having read other novels. Things can belong within a broader context of thought and literature without belonging specifically to a genre that exists within that broader context. If things couldn't do that, we would never have any novelty. And I think that if we take the particular case of maybe Job and Ecclesiastes, each of them is in its own way highly innovative, and perhaps that's why it has become classic canonical literature.
I think Will Kynes wanted to jump in, but there have been a couple of questions directed to you, Will. One in particular from David Lambert, where he's asking if you can speak to the pragmatics of your own critique. What's at stake seems to be more than just saying that this collection of texts is not wisdom. Is there more that you're trying to do?
Yeah. So in 8 minutes, I just wasn't able to get to the second half of my book, but that actually I think is one of my favorite parts, where I dig deeper into genre theory, and it addresses in some sense some of the points that Dr. Collins made up, because, or made, not made up, but the way that I understand genre theory is very similar. It builds on some of the things that Stuart has written in the past about we as readers see significance in certain connections between groups of texts. And that significance, what we see as significant, is shaped by our cultural perspective. And therefore, it's important to listen to ways that people have read the text from different cultural perspectives than our own. And yes, that does include pre-critical interpreters. But one of the other questions is how Eurocentric this discussion can be. And so it's really important for us also to listen to perspectives from non-European scholars, because they may, because of the interests of their cultural context, see different connections between texts than we do. So what I'm saying is, once we get rid of wisdom literature as the category in which these texts are understood, it opens up new ways of seeing these genre similarities between texts. And I would push back against some of the stuff that Stuart just said about, secondary genres and so forth, as helpful as it is, but I prefer to put it in the context of what Derrida says about genres, that texts participate in genres without belonging to them. So there's a sense in which a part of a text could participate in a certain genre that we as readers could notice. So if we use Job, which you just brought up, Sam, it is really important to notice the similarities between Job and Proverbs, but it's also really important to notice the similarities between Job and the Psalms. And what started me down this whole road is that I did my PhD on connections between Job and the Psalms, and so many of those connections had been missed because people weren't looking past that category division between wisdom literature and Psalms. So what I'm looking to create is an opportunity for what I call a more three-dimensional or multi-perspectival approach to the genres of these books that sees the various genres that they can be placed into as different readers look at them from different perspectives. So I acknowledge that I have a perspective, but in order to diffuse the impact of my perspective, whatever theology I may have, I want to learn from others as well, not impose mine as the perspective on these texts, as 19th century scholars seem to have done, and we have seemed to just adopt without thinking about it.
Can I just jump in here? Because I just want to caution against something. I think there might be this idea that if we eliminate the use of a term or a category, that we'll be able to do all kinds of miraculous things like eliminate implicit bias, and we'll be able to unload all of the historical baggage that we carry with us when we read texts. And I fear that it might actually do the opposite, which is that we will think that we have shed the baggage of the constructed category by by dutifully avoiding the word wisdom, and then and then in turn not actually attend to the fact that we will always be bringing all kinds of historical baggage with us. We will always be bringing with us our particular training, whatever sort of theological commitments one may have or one may not have. Whatever canon that we seem to be working with, which may be different than a canon that someone else is working from. So I caution against this approach of just saying, well, we are now going to. I guess there's another thing here, which is that intertextuality is not a method; it is an observed phenomenon, right? So you observe that texts do this thing. It's like deconstruction, like texts deconstruct, okay? But that is not a methodology. That is a phenomenon that happens in texts, right? And we can observe how texts may relate within each other and may cross, our artificial generic boundaries. And may surprise us, and once we take down categories, we might be able to see how texts cross into other areas that we did not previously think. But to say that we've just solved world hunger and world peace by dutifully avoiding the word wisdom, I think might be a little bit of overselling it.
I don't think I claim to have solved world hunger in the conclusion of my book, but I'll have to read it a little more closely.
I think
you get my point.
I want to do one more question and see if we have time for maybe one or two more. But Stuart Weeks wanted to jump in and say something.
Yeah, somebody's asked about the absence of non-Eurocentric perspectives on the panel, and I do think it's worth saying something about this. There has been some very interesting work on the literature from African perspectives, and I think from Lebanese perspectives, where it's been particularly addressed towards Proverbs, and it's noted the extent to which this represents a popular phenomenon. And I genuinely think this is extremely important. I think our texts were performed. I think that our texts were, in the case of Job, possibly performed by multiple actors, as it were. It's almost like a play. I think that this feeds into something which is not an intellectual, philosophical, academic, in the European sense, movement, but that these things are the literary deposit of something that was much more widespread and probably known to many people. From that point of view, I think that the perspectives from other countries where those traditions still exist is very important. There are people in Egypt and in Lebanon who perform proverbs, who perform aphorisms in public as entertainment. Well, and have an audience in the town square. And I do think that that is a perspective that is rather lacking from our discipline.
There is to plug a publication that is in the chat that I edited along with Matthew Golf, the Blackwell Companion to Wisdom Literature. One of the essays in that volume is by South African scholar Matapon Matsinya, in which she talks about the performative aspect of Proverbs in her own South African context and shows how markedly similar some of the content is to what we find in the book of Proverbs. So I would commend that to you, that essay to you. One other interesting question that maybe going to John Collins, and just maybe as a way to bring our discussion to a close, do you think it would be profitable to think and talk about wisdom literature, to have a longer symposium conversation in which we attempt to define it the way the effort was made to define apocalyptic literature in Semia 14? Would that be a profitable enterprise or no? Or have we shown that we would just talk about what we did today? So John, maybe you could respond to that, and if others want to as well.
Maybe 30 years ago, and I wasn't willing to take it on then, and I wouldn't be willing to take it on now. I think we probably have lots of material for ongoing discussions. I mean, the whole point of definitions, from my point of view, is to get some clarity on how people are using a word. So it's not establishing entities, but at least so that we're not all using the same word but meaning different things by it. And I think if we could, if there was a way to arrive at that for this wisdom literature, that would be helpful. I'm not sure how to go about it, though.
Anybody else on that?
So not on that, but on the previous question, I just wanted to chip in at the end of that, because from an African perspective, looking at Proverbs, some very interesting work's been done also on the relationship with the law court and the use of Proverbs in legal proceedings in many African countries. And I think that's very interesting because, you know, well, I think it was mentioned about Stuart's work about Deuteronomy and Proverbs 1-9, but I mean, you know, are we somehow, because we're talking about Proverbs 1-9 as wisdom, are we then losing those legal connections that might well be there? But then, you know, transporting into a modern context like the African one, you're seeing Proverbs actually being used in cases as an alternative, really, to a legal judgment. So I think some of that is really fascinating new material that's coming through from a broad audience.
Well, on that constructive note, I think we will bring this to a close. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today. I want to thank all of you who are participating on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook for joining us. This will be or has been recorded, so it will be shareable. And if you want to watch it again, you can. Or if you're coming to it later, I'm grateful to you for participating. And as we've seen from our conversation, this is an ongoing discussion, and I appreciate your participation in it today. And once again, thanks to all the panelists for joining us. Everybody, I hope you have a pleasant evening wherever you are, and stay safe.
Can we just say a thank you to you, Sam, for organising this? It's a brilliant idea, and there were very few positives to have come out of the last year, but this sort of thing, I think, is one of them.
I appreciate it, and it's a privilege to have your colleagues and to have you as mentors and friends.
Thank you for joining us for the value of wisdom as a category for ancient texts and discourses. Please be sure to join us next week for the 2021 Sprunt Lectures. No longer shall they teach one another. The End of Theological Education, featuring Dr. Ted Smith, Professor of Preaching and Ethics at Chandler School of Theology at Emory University. Enjoy the rest of your day and go in peace.